Let me add a brief reflection on Aurelius Augustinus, or Augustine, as we say. So this video will be short and woefully insufficient in capturing the impact and influence of Augustine. After all, we have more writings by Augustine than any other ancient author. And after Plato, it's reasonable to argue that Augustine is the greatest influence on Western thought, though he himself was very influenced by Plato and the Platonic tradition, which he recognized as containing more than a seed of truth planted by the divine, even if it missed the truth of revelation. And the Platonic tradition was extremely useful for Augustine's explanation of Christianity. Now, let me just add, if you want an introduction to Augustine that is very, very interesting. This is a book by James K.A. Smith, published in 2019, called On the Road with St. Augustine. You need know nothing about theology, nothing about the history, but what Smith does is really explain this in a beautiful and inviting way. And he sees this as a conversation between Augustine and other thinkers, between other writers, and from past to present. And it's a very accessible and very interesting read. And it's a short read if you're interested in that. Augustine was an African theologian in the later Roman Empire. He was born in North Africa in 354, and he dies in North Africa in 430. And he lived his entire life in Africa, except for a 5-year period in Italy, when he's mostly in the cities of Rome and Milan in the north. Augustine was from a family of very modest means who aspired to educate their promising young son, but they needed funds of a local patron to make that happen. That is, they couldn't afford it otherwise. Now, the goal of an education in this period was to get a position in the imperial administration and possibly, in the end, to get an appointment as a prestigious and profitable position as civil governor. And Augustine was set on a secular career. And he did so with his live-in girlfriend and their son Deodatus as he pursued his education and his hopes and dreams of getting the college education and then getting that prestigious career started. Now, in his education, Augustine was profoundly influenced by the writings of Marcus Tullius Cicero. This Roman statesman and orator of the late Roman Republic. That's the 1st century BCE, hundreds of years before Augustine was born. And Cicero is the greatest Roman orator, and his Latin prose is considered the ideal form of the language. But it was not only the style of Cicero that moved Augustine, it was his philosophical ideals. In Cicero's treatise called the Hortensius, Augustine encountered Cicero's exhortation to study philosophy. And this text, which unfortunately is lost, it no longer survives, it presented Augustine with the challenge that giving in to the desires of the body, like food and sex and other pleasures, that this runs counter to the pursuits of the mind. And Augustine, as he describes himself, was inescapably bound to sexual desire. And in this philosophical text, he confronted the obvious correctness of the philosophical ideal from his perspective and the tension that makes it so hard to achieve. And this tension would influence the direction of Augustine's life and have much influence on Augustine's thought. While he did not stop yielding to his sexual desires, the philosophical text began Augustine's turn toward ethical and religious issues. Augustine's education was the fruit of the efforts of his parents, particularly his mother, Monica. And Monica was possibly of Berber descent, that is, of indigenous African descent, and that's attested by her name. And the name, again, is a Berber origin. And through her and the fame of her son, her name, Monica, would become very popular in the West. Monica was a Christian, But Augustine was not. In fact, Augustine was intellectually and aesthetically repulsed by Christianity and by the biblical texts that the Christians embraced. These texts lacked the philosophical depth, the classical ideals, the classical language, and the style to which he aspired. The Bible seemed a text only suitable to the ignorant and to those who have no knowledge of contemporary thought or science, as they thought of it at the time. And the Bible was unable to answer the key questions of life, in contrast to these other approaches. Instead, Augustine found answers in the teachings of Mani, which I addressed in another video. And these, he felt, explain the desires of the flesh and why evil happens by positing that dualistic split between matter and spirit, good and evil. And Augustine was in the Manichaean world for about 10 years of his life, first as a teacher at Carthage and then in Italy afterwards. And during this time, he viewed with contempt Christian beliefs and Christian practitioners, and he persuaded many to come into the Manichaean fold. Now, Augustine began his career as a teacher in the North African capital of Carthage, but then he moved to Rome for greater opportunity and then secured a position in the northern Italian city of Milan in 384 as the new professor of rhetoric. His career was really moving forward. And at this time, I should point out that Milan was way more important politically than Rome. It was an imperial center, that is, the emperor was in Milan, not in Rome, and Augustine hoped for further advancement, as did his mother Monica, and it was his mother that forced Augustine to send his live-in girlfriend, his common-law wife, back to North Africa. She wanted to ensure that he would be eligible to marry someone more suitable, in her opinion, in order to help advance his career. He kept his son Adeodatus with him, but he had to say goodbye to his common-law wife. Now, it was Manichaean connections that helped Augustine with his career moves, but he had increasing doubt about the efficacy of Manichaean thought to adequately explain the world in which we live. And his mother, Monica, was eager to find a way to turn her son away from these Manichaean ideas, and she was able to introduce him to the bishop of Milan, Ambrose. Now, here for the first time, Augustine encountered a Christian who was an intellectual peer, that is, someone on par with Augustine. Ambrose was from a more prestigious family, much more prestigious family than Augustine was from. Ambrose had an even better classical education. Ambrose was, of course, fluent in Latin, his native language. Ambrose was also fluent in Greek and far more proficient in the language than Augustine was. And Ambrose's sermons were infused with ideas from the classical texts, both past and present, including Plotinus. Augustine was amazed by the power of his sermons, by the intellectual might of his ideas that linked the highest achievements of classical thought with Christianity in a way that Augustine did not realize was possible. Now, at Milan, Augustine was influenced by Simplicianus, an older man who was to become Augustine's spiritual father, who welcomed Augustine into a group of lay people, that is, people who were not priests or bishops, all of whom were highly educated, and they were from prestigious social standing. And this lay community read and discussed the works of the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus and Porphyry. And again, Augustine was amazed by the content of the ideas of Neoplatonism, and this definitively ended his interest in Manichaeanism. This was clearly something superior, something that more accurately reflected the world in which we lived, according to Augustine. So we can see that Ambrose and Simplicianus and Neoplatonism were paths for Augustine's conversion to Christianity and his baptism by Bishop Ambrose in Milan in 386 in his early 30s. His mother Monica by his side to witness what she had been hoping for her entire life, Augustine's conversion. She would die shortly thereafter in Italy, and Augustine returned to Africa, where his goal was to live in a community of lay people that is not priests. He did not want to be a priest, did not want to be a bishop. He wanted to just be in a community of ascetics who worshiped, and he wanted to write and explain the faith. But this was not to last long. He was soon consecrated a priest against his will in 391, and then again as bishop in 395 of the coastal community of Hippo, where he would serve for the rest of his life, from 395 to 430 when he died. In that time, Augustine wrote volumes and volumes to explain theology and Christian ideas, to defend orthodoxy, to oppose Manichaeanism, to fight heresy, and everything in between. And just as he was starting his career as bishop, he knew that there were many people that had doubts about his conversion. After all, wasn't he a Manichaean? Don't you remember when he had his live-in lover and then lovers afterwards and even before? So there were all these doubts about him. And that's why he wrote his Confessions. And the Confessions were just as he was starting out as bishop, as a young bishop in 395. This is what I come from, this is my background, this is how I got here. And the Confessions have a psychological depth unlike any other autobiography from antiquity. So it's a remarkable text to explore the mind and the heart of Augustine. But if one wants to see a synthesis of all his ideas, one can turn to the City of God, this much longer text, this massive text, which in some ways is the culmination of the ideas of the classical world, of the ancient Mediterranean. In it, one will see Augustine responding to Roman history, responding to classical ideas, responding to Neoplatonism, and responding to the traumas of his day. So the City of God is a response to the sack of Rome in 410 by the Goths, and by the accusation that the sack happened because of Christianity, giving Augustine the opportunity to reflect on the relationship of faith and history. As he's thinking through the relationship of church and state, or rather he's thinking through the relationship of the believer living in the world and in the state. It's a reflection on history. It's a reflection on theology. It's a reflection on time itself. And Augustine would continue this work down to the very end of his life in 430, when the German Vandals had invaded North Africa and were besieging his own city of Hippo. As the Vandals were at the gates of the city, Augustine breathed his last.